Bound by Grace, the journey of Jonathan and Leah. Episode 2, Healing and Financial Crisis. They knelt together in prayer, surrendering their regrets to God, asking Him to take the weight of their past and replace it with hope for the future. In that moment, they felt a sense of release, like a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. It wasn't that the memories would disappear, but the hold those memories had on them was finally broken. As Jonathan and Leah continued to heal, they felt a stirring in their hearts to use their journey as a testimony. It began as small conversations with couples at church who were going through tough times, but soon it became clear that God had more in store for them. Their story, once filled with so much pain, was now a beacon of hope for others who were struggling in their marriages. One Sunday after service, a young couple approached them. The husband, with tear-filled eyes, admitted that he had been unfaithful and was afraid his wife would never forgive him. The wife, though devastated, was torn between leaving and staying. Jonathan and Leah shared their own story, how they had been in the same place many years ago, and how God had restored what seemed irreparable. That conversation sparked something within the young couple, giving them the courage to seek help and fight for their marriage. It was the first of many couples Jonathan and Leah would mentor. Soon they were invited to lead a marriage ministry at their church, where they helped guide other couples through their own seasons of hardship. They weren't experts, but they were living proof that God's grace could heal even the deepest wounds. They spoke honestly about their failures, about the hurt and betrayal, but also about the power of forgiveness and faith. In their vulnerability, they gave others permission to be vulnerable too. As the years passed, Jonathan and Leah experienced one of the greatest joys of their lives, the wedding of their daughter, Sarah. After returning to her faith, Sarah had met a young man named Daniel who shared her love for God and her passion for serving others. The two of them quickly became inseparable, and when Daniel proposed, Jonathan and Leah couldn't have been happier. The wedding day was a mixture of emotions for Jonathan and Leah. As they watched Sarah walk down the aisle, they couldn't help but remember their own wedding day, filled with so much hope and expectation. But unlike the naive optimism they had carried into their marriage, Sarah and Daniel stood at the altar with eyes wide open, knowing that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice, one they would have to make every day. When it was time for Jonathan to give his speech, he spoke from the heart. Sarah, Daniel, marriage isn't easy. Your mum and I, we've been through more than we ever imagined we would. But I stand here today, not as someone who did everything right, but as someone who has seen the power of God's grace in action. Love is a choice to forgive, to keep fighting, to put God at the center. If you do that, you'll not only survive, but you'll thrive. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Jonathan finished speaking. Sarah embraced her parents, tears streaming down her face. She knew their story, knew the battles they had fought, and the love that had emerged stronger on the other side. It was a testament to God's faithfulness, and she prayed that her own marriage would reflect that same grace. With Sarah now married and out of the house, Jonathan and Leah entered a new season of life. The house was quieter, and there was a sense of peace that hadn't existed before. They had weathered the storms, and now they found themselves in a place of calm, a place they had never thought possible during the darkest days of their marriage. But even in this new season, they knew that marriage was a continuous journey. There would still be challenges ahead, but they were no longer afraid. They had learned that the key to a lasting marriage wasn't about avoiding the storms, but about learning how to stand together through them. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set, Leah turned to Jonathan and smiled. "We made it," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Jonathan smiled back, his hand resting on hers. "By the grace of God, we made it." They both knew that their story was far from over. There would be more chapters to write, more lessons to learn. But for now, they rested in the peace that came from knowing they had fought for their marriage, and with God's help, they had won. With Sarah married and their ministry flourishing, Jonathan and Leah entered a phase they called the quiet years. Life settled into a calm rhythm: work, church, ministry, and spending time together. It was a stark contrast to the years filled with turmoil, but they embraced the peace. They no longer felt the need to rush or chase after anything. Instead, they found joy in the simple moments, having breakfast together, praying over each other before bed, and taking walks in the cool evening air. Leah had always believed that contentment was something you had to chase, something just out of reach. But now she realized it had been there all along, waiting for them to surrender their struggles and rest in God's provision. "I never imagined we could be this happy," she said one evening, looking at Jonathan with a smile. "Not after everything." Jonathan nodded, his heart full. "It was worth the fight," he replied, taking her hand. In these quiet years, they learned that the deepest kind of love isn't found in passion or drama, but in faithfulness, in the decision to stay, to forgive, and to keep loving even when it's hard. Although Jonathan and Leah's marriage had healed, the past still had a way of resurfacing. Leah occasionally found herself revisiting old wounds in her mind, wondering if she had done enough, if she had been too weak for too long. Meanwhile, Jonathan struggled with his own insecurities. He still felt guilt about the choices he made years ago and often wondered how different their lives could have been if he hadn't made those mistakes. It wasn't unusual for them to revisit these conversations late at night as the house sat still and quiet. One night, Leah asked Jonathan, "Do you ever regret it? Everything we went through?" Jonathan, deep in thought, shook his head slowly. "I regret the pain I caused you, but I don't regret where it brought us." Leah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't regret it either. Every tear, every argument, and every moment of pain had led them to a place of understanding and deep, unconditional love. Still, they knew the shadows of their past could never be erased completely. They would simply learn how to navigate them, with God's grace lighting the way. As they settled into their quiet years, Jonathan's health began to falter. What started as fatigue soon became a series of doctor's visits and tests. Leah found herself caring for him more and more, but she did so gladly. It was nothing compared to the emotional strain they had endured. But the weight of seeing Jonathan struggle physically took its toll on her heart. One day, after a particularly difficult appointment, Leah sat down with Jonathan and asked, "What if this gets worse? What if we can't do the things we planned?" Jonathan, his face pale and tired, smiled weakly. "Then we trust God like we always have." Jonathan's illness tested Leah's strength in ways she hadn't expected. But just as they had faced every other challenge in their marriage, they faced this one together, trusting that God would carry them through the storm. As Jonathan's health worsened, Leah became his full-time caregiver. It wasn't something either of them had expected, but it was a role Leah took on without hesitation. Their love had evolved once again, from partners in the ups and downs of life to something deeper, a dependency on one another that mirrored their dependency on God. Leah found herself leaning into prayer more than ever before. Every night, as Jonathan slept, she would kneel beside their bed, praying for his healing, for strength, and for the courage to face whatever was coming next. Jonathan too spent his days in prayer, grateful for the love Leah showed him every day, despite his physical weakness. It wasn't easy, but it was beautiful in its own way. They had fought for their marriage, and now they were fighting for each other in a different battle. And through it all, they continued to cling to their faith, trusting that God was still writing their story. While Leah and Jonathan were navigating the challenges of Jonathan's illness, Sarah was facing difficulties of her own. Marriage had proven to be harder than she anticipated. She and Daniel loved each other deeply, but they were struggling to communicate, to balance their work and home life, and to navigate the complexities of starting a family. Sarah found herself turning to Leah more often for advice. "How did you and Dad do it?" she asked one day, her voice filled with frustration and exhaustion. "How did you survive all the storms?" Leah, holding Sarah's hand, offered gentle words of wisdom. "We didn't always get it right, and sometimes we barely survived, but we always went back to the same place, back to God. He's the one who carried us, Sarah. You have to fight for each other, and you have to fight together." It was advice Sarah took to heart, and over time, she and Daniel found their way through the storm. But seeing her daughter struggle brought back memories for Leah. It was a reminder that every marriage, no matter how strong, faced seasons of hardship, and that every season required surrender to God's will. Jonathan's health took a turn for the worse in the years that followed. Leah spent sleepless nights beside him, praying over him, caring for him as his condition deteriorated. They had once envisioned this season of life differently, traveling, enjoying their grandchildren, continuing their ministry. But now their world had become much smaller. One particularly hard night, as Jonathan lay in bed weak and unable to speak, Leah knelt by his side. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "God, I don't know what you're doing, but I trust you. Please don't take him from me yet." She prayed for healing, but more than that, she prayed for peace. Peace to accept whatever the future held. Even in the valley, Jonathan and Leah's faith never wavered. They had been through so much together, and while this was their hardest battle yet, they knew God's presence was still with them. Despite the bleak prognosis, Jonathan's faith remained steadfast. Leah watched in awe as he continued to speak words of encouragement to those around him, even as his own body grew weaker. He would often tell Leah, "God is good, no matter what happens. Whether I'm healed or not, we've won because He's with us." Leah clung to those words. Her heart ached at the thought of losing him, but she knew he was right. Their love, their marriage, their entire journey had been one long testimony of God's faithfulness. And even if this chapter ended with loss, they had already won the most important battle, staying together and keeping their faith. In Jonathan's final days, Leah rarely left his side. Their home became a quiet place of prayer, where family and friends came to say their goodbyes. Sarah and her siblings gathered around, holding their father's hands, praying over him and sharing stories of the life he had lived so well. Leah's heart broke as she watched Jonathan slip away, but there was also a strange sense of peace. They had walked through fire together, but they had never walked alone. God had been with them every step of the way, and now He was preparing to take Jonathan home. On a quiet morning, surrounded by his family, Jonathan took his last breath. Leah held his hand as tears fell from her eyes, her heart heavy with grief, but also filled with gratitude. "Thank you, God," she whispered. "Thank you for the years we had, for the love we shared, for the grace you gave us." Jonathan's death marked the end of an era, but Leah knew it wasn't truly the end. Their love would live on in the lives of their children and grandchildren, in the ministry they had built together, and in the testimony of their faith. And though her heart ached with the loss, she also knew that Jonathan was now in the arms of the one who had sustained them both. The days following Jonathan's death were filled with both sorrow and sweet memories. Leah found herself overwhelmed with grief, but she also felt an immense sense of peace. The battle was over, and Jonathan was with the Lord. But learning to live without him, after so many years of leaning on each other, was a challenge Leah wasn't sure how to face. She spent her mornings in prayer, asking God to fill the void Jonathan had left behind. And slowly, day by day, God began to heal her broken heart. Though the pain of loss never fully disappeared, Leah found comfort in knowing that Jonathan's legacy would live on, and that she would one day see him again. In the quiet of her home, now so much emptier without Jonathan, Leah began the slow process of rebuilding her life. For decades, she had lived for her marriage, her family, and her ministry with Jonathan. Now she faced an unexpected season of solitude. The grief was heavy, but Leah knew she couldn't let it paralyze her. Jonathan wouldn't have wanted that. Leah turned to her faith in a way she hadn't before. She spent hours in prayer, seeking comfort and direction. God, she prayed one evening, tears staining her cheeks, I'm not sure how to do this. I don't know how to live this life without him. In her heart, she felt God's presence and his quiet whisper, You're not alone. I am still with you. With each passing day, Leah felt God's strength carrying her. It wasn't easy, but slowly she learned to live in this new reality. She began to see the ways God was still working, even in the midst of her pain. As Leah adjusted to life without Jonathan, she realized the profound impact he had left on those around him. At his funeral, countless people had shared stories of how Jonathan had touched their lives through his faith, his kindness, and his perseverance. Even in his last days, Jonathan had spoken words of encouragement to everyone who visited him, reminding them that God's love transcends all circumstances. Sarah and her siblings began to reflect on their father's legacy as well. Dad never gave up, Sarah said one day as she sat with her mother. Even when things were the hardest, he always pointed us back to God. Leah nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She missed Jonathan deeply, but knowing how many lives he had touched gave her a sense of peace. His legacy wasn't just in the family he had built, but in the countless lives he had influenced through his faith and love. Leah knew that, in many ways, Jonathan was still with them. Watch out for the next episode. Please do subscribe so that you do not miss episode 3.